This morning, instead of talking about the renewal of all things, we'll jump back into that next week. This morning, I'd like to talk for a few moments about the idea of fluency. That's an odd word, right? Fluency. Let me ask you, is anyone here fluent in a language other than English? Anyone? Karen? What language? Espanol. All right, well, cool. See, you're going to fit right into the...
She speaks pretty good Kentucky holler, too.
Oh, see? Well, see, my next question was whether or not anyone was fluent in more than two languages. So you call. First service, nobody raised their hand except, I think, who was it? Yeah, they said, well, we're fluent in Southern. And so I think that's true. That's very true of our crowd. And we joke that not even Marcus is fluent in Southern. So we're fluent in something, right? I am jealous. I get jealous of people who are fluent in more than one language. I have always been sort of a fan, a very casual student of languages. I think languages are cool. I think it's neat to see where language comes from. I'm a big proponent of the idea that language builds culture. And actually the flip of that is true too, that culture also builds language. And I think it's really interesting to learn languages from around the world. Over the last few months, I've really been working in a more serious way on becoming more fluent in Spanish. It seems like the Spanish language has always been a part of my life. My dad, I remember as a small child, my dad was always speaking. He's not fluent in Spanish, but he knew enough to be dangerous. And I can remember him, trying to teach us how to count in Spanish or certain words that he would say. And so I was already getting that input as a small child. And I am of that age. I am a Sesame Street kid, so I spent my childhood learning from Sesame Street. Sometimes I still turn it on from every now and then because it was cool to learn that way. When it came time in high school to fulfill the foreign language requirement, my high school had three languages that they offered. They offered French, they offered Spanish, and they offered Latin. And being the studious high school student that I was, I figured that Spanish was the easiest, so that was going to be the easiest A. I'll be honest, though, to this day, I still regret not taking Latin. I think Latin's a pretty cool language also. And I realized over the last few years that I really enjoyed Spanish, but my level of Spanish was what I termed menu Spanish. Do y'all know what I mean by that? I know enough Spanish to order off the menu. I know enough Spanish to read between the lines and know what a dish is built of, but I'm not very fluent. And it's recently, in the last few months, last couple of years, it's become more and more important for me to have a deeper understanding of the Spanish language. I don't want to just read off of a menu. I want to be able to have a conversation. I want to have a relationship with someone who is a Spanish-speaking individual and to be able to listen and comprehend what they are trying to tell me and then also converse back with them. And I've tried a few different ways of doing this, of learning Spanish. I did the Rosetta Stone for a while, and that never clicked for me. I looked into taking real, honest-to-goodness lessons. But really what has worked best for me over the last couple of months is a little app. It's a free app called Duolingo. Is anybody else familiar with Duolingo? Okay, a couple of people. I like Duolingo. Some people like it, some people don't. I like it. I like that I can set a reminder on there. It'll pop up. In fact, it already has this morning, reminding me that, hey, it's time for your lesson. I can set it up to where I say, hey, I want to spend 15 minutes in lessons on a daily basis or whatever. And it's quick and it's easy, and really, no matter where I am, I can pull out my phone and do a lesson or two and get that ongoing practice in learning Spanish. I really have enjoyed it. And I know most probably at my age, I'm not ever going to truly become fluent in Spanish. I'm not going to become a native speaker in Spanish. I know that. And there are sometimes that we look at realities like that and it's easy to give up. But my goal isn't really to become a native speaker in Spanish. My goal is simply to become more fluent today than I was yesterday. Whatever little step I need to make today, I become more fluent today than I was yesterday. And when we talk about this idea of fluency or becoming fluent, what we're really talking about is that what we want to do is to mature in our use of that language or in a particular subject matter. This theme of fluency or maturity is a major theme in the letters of the Apostle Paul, and especially in the book of Ephesians. I don't know if you've ever taken much of a dive into the book of Ephesians. I love the book of Ephesians. I think it's a great insight into who we are to be as the family of God, as His church. Some scholars even use the term constitution, that if the Christian church had a constitution, much like a country has a constitution, if the church had a constitution, that the book of Ephesians would probably come closest to being that document. In essence, the letter to the Ephesians is really the benefit of Paul's distillation of ideas about growing and maturing as the body of Christ. And so it's no surprise that Paul would address this idea of fluency or maturity that we should work towards. Now, again, obviously this isn't in your bulletin, but I'd like to read for you a passage. This comes from chapter 4 in the book of Ephesians. I'm going to start in verse 11. Paul says, "Now these are the gifts that Christ gave to the church, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers. Their responsibility is to equip God's people to do His work and to build up the church, which is the body of Christ. This will continue until we all come to such unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. Then we will no longer be immature like children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever that they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love." This is maturity. We will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of His body, the church. And for the remainder of that chapter, chapter 4, Paul describes what this process of becoming fluent looks like until he hits the beginning of chapter 5, where he says this. This is the first two verses of chapter 5. Paul says, "Therefore, imitate God in everything you do." Imitate God in everything you do because you are His dear children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us and offered Himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. It's this maturity or fluency that Paul is challenging his readers and us toward. We call this idea discipleship. And just like when we see this idea of fluency, and it happens in a language or a subject matter, to where when that happens, when we know a subject or a language so much that we don't even really have to think about it, right? We don't have to piece together ideas in our head. It just flows from who we are You know, when you're learning a language, you have to go through that process of you're going to listen to someone speaking in another language, and so then you have to translate it in your own head. Okay, what are they saying into English? And so now I want to respond. So I've got to think about what I want to say, and then I've got to translate it into that language, and then I've got to speak it correctly so that communication can actually happen. And that's tiresome. It's tiring to be immature or non-fluent in a subject matter or trying to communicate with someone else. But when we become mature in a subject matter, when we become mature in a language, we don't have to piece together those ideas. It just flows. Fluency in the gospel happens the same way. Paul says that this fluency in the gospel, this maturity, looks like this. He says it looks like when we speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ. And when Paul says speaking the truth in love, this is really shorthand for speaking what is true about Jesus. And not just speaking about it, but speaking what is true about Jesus to one another. In other words, we're speaking good news into each other's lives. The author, Jeff Vanderstel, puts it this way. He says, God wants his people to be able to translate the world around them and the world inside of them through the lens of the gospel. And the gospel is the truths of God revealed in the person and work of Jesus. Have you ever been around someone who sort of jokes their way through speaking the language? You know how we do, this happens especially with Spanish, right? Have you ever been around someone that their way of speaking Spanish is that they put an L before every word and an O behind every word, so like el planto on el stando, and we sort of they joke their way through, speaking that language and they create this form of Spanglish, This is, in the true sense of the word, this is an immature or a non-fluent way of trying to communicate. Unfortunately, we often deal with the same level of non-fluency when it comes to the gospel. Unfortunately, our churches are filled with messages like, when God closes a door, he opens a window. Or, God never gives us more than we can carry or we can bear. And just like El Planto is this weird form of Spanglish, we tend to also see this form of gospelish within the church. So how do we get beyond that? How do we mature in our use of the gospel? How do we become fluent in our understanding and our speaking of Jesus to each other? You see, our desire as disciples is to become more fluent in the gospel every day. How do we do that? How do we become more fluent? How do we work towards a level of being so filled with the good news of Jesus that we don't even have to translate it? Once again, I think we can take a lesson from the idea of becoming fluent in another language. Most of the time, when we want to learn something new or learn a new language, when we desire to mature or become fluent in a subject, we look towards some form of formal training, right? But most educators, especially in the field of languages, instead of, hey, you need to sit in a class and you need a teacher that's just always giving you information and you need to write that information down, most educators instead point towards two ideas. One is immersion, and the second is ongoing practice. And so let's briefly take a few moments and look at each of these and how they relate to becoming gospel fluent. First is the idea of immersion. I know that immersion, especially in our context, in our community, as disciples, immersion has special spiritual significance, right? It relates to baptism, baptistry back there. But what I'm talking about here is not immersion of water. It is immersive learning. It's the idea that you learn something best when you immerse or saturate yourself in that subject or language.
A few years ago, Sharon and I knew that our 30th wedding anniversary was coming up in 2020. And so we began to prepare for a dream trip, something we had dreamed about for several years. And we organized a 2-week visit to Mexico, spending our time primarily in Mexico City and in Oaxaca. We didn't want to be tourists. We didn't want to just go lay on the beach. Those are great things, and those are great things to do. That was not the point of what we wanted to do. We wanted a local experience. We wanted to be as local as possible. We wanted to walk through the mercados and sample the authentic local cuisine. Now, I'll just give you a little preview here. I'm preaching again in June, and I'm going to share my experience with the grasshoppers in June. So you need to mark that on your calendar if you want to hear about grasshoppers on your plate. Come back in June. But in order to look at this trip, we began brushing up on our Spanish. We knew that where we were headed, there was going to be very little English spoken. And obviously, COVID came and delayed our dream trip until the end of last year. But in November of 2021, we finally got to go. And where we began our trip, nervous about the difference in languages, we came home not fluent, but at least more at ease than we ever thought possible. 2 weeks of being immersed into the Spanish language wasn't going to make us experts, but it did give us a sense of confidence that really, honestly, we didn't expect. In fact, it took us a few days after getting home to figure out what you all were saying. And to this day, we still miss that the musical nature of the Spanish language, of sitting out in the cafe and just hearing the language around us. It's so musical. So to continue that idea of immersion, we watch a lot of TV or YouTube videos in Spanish. I have a favorite YouTube channel, and it's this abuela, it's this grandmother deep in central Mexico, and basically every video of hers, she's teaching how to cook. She's teaching a different dish. It's entirely in Spanish. I mean, even the description, the written description on YouTube is entirely in Spanish. I know enough to know what what the finished dish is supposed to be. But most of the time, I don't understand the specifics of what she's saying. But the more I watch those, and the more that I listen to her words and watch her demonstrate her recipes, I'm picking it up dish by dish. I'm learning Spanish, and I'm learning some cool new food too. So what does this have to do with becoming gospel fluent? Just like we chose to surround ourselves with opportunities to hear and experience the language, if we are going to become fluent in the gospel, we have to surround ourselves with the good news that is Jesus. And that means we have to be intentional about dedicating our time and our energy and our resources to not just learning about Jesus, but really learning Him. That means not just sitting in a class and listening to others talk about Him. It means reading and listening to what Jesus had to say. It means seeing how He treated others and then practicing that in our daily lives. A simple way that I have found over the last couple of years, a simple way that has helped me immerse myself in Jesus is a simple repetition of reading the Gospels. Somewhere around the middle of 2019, I began a rhythm of reading through a Gospel every 2 weeks. If you look up the Gospels, you can easily get through a Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, by reading basically 2 chapters of the Gospel a day, and you can get through pretty much any of them in less than 15 days. So I can do 2 Gospels a month. If you read 2 chapters a day, you can get through it, 15 days, 2 a month, and in fact, that causes a rhythm for me that I can get through all 4 of the Gospels every 2 months. And then I start over, and then I start over, and then I start over. And in order to cure any boredom that might come along, because let's face it, you're reading the same thing over and over again, right? But the fact is, each time I go through them, I go through them in a different version. One time it may be in the NIV. The next time I read through it, it may be in the Message. The next time it may be in the English Standard Version. Sometimes I don't read them, I listen to them. I use a Bible app or I use an audio Bible and I listen to them instead. Sometimes I even watch online. There are 4 actual movies, one of each of the Gospels, and they are literal, word by word, readings of the Gospels while it's acted out, and it's pretty good. It was shot over in Morocco or somewhere, and so to watch the life of Jesus as the Gospel is being read to you, it makes it a bit more immersive. This is a great way of going through the Gospels and learning Jesus, and especially with the movies. If you're a more visual person, it really helps. And if our goal is to become more fluent in Jesus and His good news, then we must find wherever, in whatever way, that works for us in order to saturate our lives with Him. The more you immerse yourself in the Gospels, the more fluent you become, and the more confident you will be in speaking His truth in love into the lives of those around you. So this takes us to the second component of becoming fluent. The first is being immersive. The second is ongoing practice. In technical education terms, this means use it or lose it, right? You know, that's my master's degree in education boils down to use it or lose it, right? But maybe it's not that exactly. But it does speak to the point that it's great to immerse yourself in a subject or a language, but if you're not having a practice of that in an ongoing way, you're not ever going to learn or achieve anything new. Yesterday was the Kentucky Derby, right? We all know that those horses don't come to the point of being the contenders that they are by running around the track once or twice and then saving themselves for the big day. Right? You don't have this horse that, ran around the track a couple of times back in 2021, said, okay, I'm good, I'm waiting until May 7th. We don't have it that way. Or learning a new piece of music, right? I was in marching band in high school, and in my marching band days, we would do what we call run the show, right? In the summer, we would come together, we would learn our music for the marching show. We would learn the formations that we were work through. We'd go to band camp. We'd sweat out in the Nashville summer for a week, and we'd learn the show. And for the rest of the season, we would run the show. Every day at our 4 hours of practice, we would run the show. And when we got done with running the show, we would run the show. And when we got done, we had a little Gatorade break, then we would run the show, right? You're getting the rhythm of this, right? We'd run it, and we'd run it, and we'd run it again. We'd practice those 10 minutes of music and formations hundreds of times in the summer and the fall for that season in order to prepare for one performance on the last Saturday of October. And all that running through the show and all that repetition was why we became state champions year after year. Let's go back to becoming fluent in a language. I mentioned earlier that the app Duolingo is really helping me, and it is, but part of what is happening in those daily sessions is a lot of practice. Sometimes I'm dealing with the same sentence 10 different ways. Sometimes it's speaking to me and I have to write out in English what they're saying. Sometimes I have to read it in English and speak it in Spanish to the app. Sometimes I'm having to tap the little words, saying this is what you're saying. But I'm going to be honest. There are days that if I have to speak or write or read mi pasaporte está en el hotel one more time, I'm going to rip out my hair, right? But you know what? I'm not going to forget that sentence anytime soon. I know it's hard, and it's ongoing, and it's repetitious. But every time we do that with whatever it is we're wanting to learn, it becomes easier to think through each time it comes around. Sharon and I are also blessed that, the staff over at El Tapatio, that's our favorite Mexican restaurant here in town. El Tapatio, the staff there knows that we're trying our best to learn Spanish. We told them that a long time ago. We try to speak it back and forth with them. And the great thing is that they hold us to that commitment. You know, there are times that when they remember who we are, and they're not too busy and everything, they'll hold us to it. No English, and they lovingly forgive our mistakes and our confusion, and they help us to grow more fluent in their language. And oh, by the way, we're getting to develop gospel relationships with them, missional relationships with them, one meal at a time. You see, if you and I are going to become fluent in speaking the good news that is Jesus, we've got to develop intentional rhythms of ongoing practice. One of the best ways of doing this is surrounding yourself with others who are working towards the same goals. We find here at FCC, we find that our missional communities are great vehicles for this. The MC that we're a part of has grown together over the last few years, so much so that we have become more and more confident and comfortable speaking Jesus into each other's lives. This doesn't mean that we go around preaching at each other, we quote some Hallmark saying when we're dealing with things. This means that when we're going through the stuff of life as we do together, as we are in the daily lives of each other, this means we are listening to each other and we're speaking the good news of Jesus into the lives of my extended family and my MC. We're becoming more fluent in His gospel every day. In the last few months, we've started this brand new rhythm, which I'm really loving. It's a beautiful rhythm. And so each month, we take time, if we have a member of our MC who is having a birthday that month, we have one particular time at our family meal that we celebrate that person having their birthday. It's not just cake or pie. What we do is we take the time and each of us goes around and blesses the birthday person with the words that the Spirit gives us. We tell them how we see Jesus in them. We tell them how Jesus is living out in their lives. Now, you may be getting a little itchy right now, thinking about having to do something so touchy-feely like that, but I'm telling you, it is so incredibly beautiful to hear my brothers and sisters, my extended family of my MC, speak Jesus into the lives of each other. If that's the type of gospel community that you think you might like to be a part of, I'm just going to put a plug here and say, I'd love to talk with you further about it. I'd love to have a conversation with you. But you may be sitting there and going, Bob, I don't want to be a native speaker like that. I just want to take the next step. I just want the next baby step towards being more fluent in this gospel thing. And that's okay. So let me give you one other idea. One that gives you the opportunity to have some ongoing practice without diving too deep when you're not ready. This summer, we're bringing back an opportunity that we did here at FCC a few years ago. This is called the Great Neighborhood Cookout. And this June, we are challenging our FCC family in participating in the Great Neighborhood Cookout wherever you live here in our area. This is, if you don't know what that is, this is simply where you gather a handful of other FCC family members and host a cookout in your neighborhood simply to love on and bless your neighbors. This isn't designed to be a come to FCC invitation party or anything. It's not trying to be a Bible study. You're simply there to host and to love on and maybe even meet your neighbors for the very first time. You can find out more about this in the May newsletter. I wrote about it. Or come and talk with me. I'd love to talk with you more. We have a little toolkit that we can get to you with some ideas and some helps in planning them. That is a great way of that ongoing practice of just having that simple gospel fluency in your neighborhood. Immersion in ongoing practice, the pathway to gospel fluency. Why work towards becoming more gospel fluent? I should have started with that, right? Why? Because simply as disciples of Jesus, we're not called to just merely have some deep personal connection with Jesus. That's important. But it's not all there is. Our relationship with Jesus is personal, but it was never meant to be private. As disciples of Jesus, we are called to cultivate the joy of God, the wholeness of God, the good news of God, wherever we live and learn and work and play. In essence, we are to give them Jesus. And we do this by being fluent in his gospel. Pray with me. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together, to become immersed together in your good news. To live in this life together, to expand your kingdom together, and to practice this good news together. Father, I pray that your Spirit will speak through us, that he will motivate us to become more fluent in your good news, so that we may, as Paul said, grow up into maturity, speaking your truth into the lives of others. We pray these things in your Son's name. Amen.